Thank you so much for joining us. And you all know because you registered to come, but this is the third in our series of what we're calling core trainings for Zen Peacemakers. And it occurred to us that it might be nice to offer a very accessible, free, recurring set of classes on the most fundamental practices and aspects of Zen Peacemaker. So we have three different courses that we're cycling through, one a month, and we repeat 4 times a year. Introduction to meditation, introduction to council practice, and tonight we'll be talking about introduction to the Three Tenets. We're talking about adding a fourth one on bearing witness, so stand by for that. We'll let you know about that soon. So I want to save all the time I possibly can. My friend Sensei Jim Daikan Bastien is here with us tonight, and he will be talking about the Three Tenets. And Daikan is the abbot of Howling Dragon Zendo in Vermont, and also works with the VA, with veterans that are in the legal system, and has a long career in helping people in that way. And I'll let him say more about that if he'd like to when he gets into it. So we are recording tonight, so if you want to go back to some of this later, it'll be available for you in a few days. So once again, thanks so much, and we appreciate your support and participation, and I'll hand it over to Daikan.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction, and I want to welcome everybody to this evening's workshop on the Three Tenets, the Zen Peacemakers Three Tenets. So I'm going to basically talk a little bit about the Three Tenets. I'll do some, I'll define them, and then I'm going to share some Zen stories, I think, that kind of illustrate the workings of the Three Tenets. And then with time permitting, have a case that we can take a look at as a group to see how the Three Tenets might apply to that particular case, and then answer any questions that you might have. So let me begin by saying the Three Tenets of the Zen Peacemakers were first developed by Roshi Bernie Glassman, my teacher, back in 1994. He had founded the Zen community of New York, and he was really taking Zen practice in some ways out of the Zendo and into the world, and created what was known as the Zen Peacemaker Order. And for those individuals that wanted to train with him, become formal students of his, they would go through a ceremony called Jukai and then take the precepts. And 3 of those precepts are called the 3 pure precepts, which are do no evil, do good, and do good with others. And Bernie kind of transformed those 3 precepts into the 3 tenets of the Zen Peacemakers. And the reason he did that is he wanted to create actionable items that people could use every day in their lives. So he came up with the 3 tenets, which are not knowing, bearing witness, and taking action, sometimes known as loving action. Now, before I get further into the 3 precepts, I want to kind of review a couple of basic Buddhist principles that will kind of run through this presentation. And first one is what we call dependent co-origination or dependent arising. And this is the idea that everything that exists, everything that has existed, everything that exists now, and everything that will ever exist, exists as a result of conditions. That there's this basic contingency that's continuously working that gives rise to everything that we see, hear, smell, touch, and know, etc. So reality is at its very most basic sense relational. Right? We live in a relational universe. Everything that exists depends on everything else for its existence. Right? Bernie used to call that the one body, or the oneness and interconnectedness of life. So that's one principle. Another principle that goes hand in hand is impermanence. So everything is interconnected, interrelated, and it's continually changing. So that's kind of the basic idea behind the Buddhist view of reality. Okay. So Bernie once said, we must realize that all events, people, and objects are just relationships, interactions of phenomena that reflect other interactions of phenomena. In fact, each of us as an individual, our existence is totally dependent on things that we are not. Things that we are not. Okay, so let's talk about the first tenet, not knowing, letting go of fixed ideas about yourself, others, and the universe. So this is kind of a pretty radical statement, not knowing about any fixed ideas, yourself, others, and the universe. So not knowing is entering every situation without being attached to your opinion, your idea, or your concept, which results in a stance of openness, flexibility, and welcoming. You know, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth, as many of you may know, was that life is marked by suffering. Physical, intellectual, emotional, spiritual suffering. And that the cause of suffering is sometimes called desire. The third noble truth is that there is a way to end suffering, and the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Noble Path. But what's really interesting, when you look at the word in Sanskrit, which is dukkha, which is translated as like desire, right? What that word actually relates to in ancient Sanskrit is a wheel that won't turn, that the hub of the wheel is stuck. It's in a fixed position, and no movement can occur. And that is the basis of suffering. So when we take that notion and relate it to our ideas, our opinions, our condition, our situation, to the extent that we are attached to a particular idea or situation, we become stuck because we fixate on this particular way of having things be, that they must be this way, or they have to be this way, or they can't be this way. And that fixation is like the wheel that won't turn. Okay. So when we say not knowing, it's letting go of fixed ideas about yourself, others, and the universe. Not getting stuck in our opinions, our situation, our condition. Bernie once said to me, and he made me laugh, he said, "Everything I say, Jim, is my opinion. I really don't know the truth." And this guy was an aerospace engineer, okay, with a PhD in applied mathematics. And he was working on the manned mission to Mars back in the 60s. He was working out the math of all that. So for someone to say, everything is my opinion, I really don't know the truth, it's a pretty bold statement for a scientist, a research scientist to say. And actually a very powerful statement about the nature of reality, which he came to know. So let's talk a little bit about a meeting between Bodhidharma and Emperor Wu, which is a very famous story, a Zen story, that relates to the idea of not knowing. So back in the 6th century, Emperor Wu was the emperor of China, and Buddhism had migrated into China starting in the 1st century. And so fast forward about 400 or 500 years later, and Emperor Wu was a devotee of Buddhism. He built a lot of temples. He supported a lot of the Sangha, the monks at that time. but no real enlightened master had actually come to China yet. And that all changed when Bodhidharma came. He was the 28th patriarch, Buddhist patriarch with a lineage, mind-to-mind transmission going all the way back to the Buddha. And so when Emperor Wu heard that he was in China, he, of course, summoned him to his court because he wanted to meet the great master. Now, the first thing that Emperor Wu wanted to know was what Bodhidharma thought of all the great things that he had done on behalf of Buddhism. So he asked him what merit he had received for building all these temples and supporting the existing Sangha. And much to his surprise, Bodhidharma responded by saying, none whatsoever. Now, this kind of unsettled Emperor Wu because he was very steeped in the notions of reincarnation and karma, which are very tied to each other. And the idea is that, you know, if you do good works, you gain merit, and that helps you advance to a better life in your next life. These were his ideas about Buddhism. So after Bodhidharma said none whatsoever, Emperor Wu was a little confused and said, well, what is the meaning of the holy truths of Buddhism? In other words, I thought karma and rebirth, reincarnation were the holy truths of Buddhism. What are they? If that's not in play. And Bodhidharma said, vast emptiness, nothing holy. Vast emptiness, nothing holy. Now that'll bring your mind to a stop. That'll put you in a little bit of a state of not knowing. And that's what happens with not knowing. It brings your conceptualizing mind to a halt. Then what? Now what? So the emperor didn't know what to say. He scratched his head and then he said, well, who stands here before me then? You're Bodhidharma, the 28th patriarch, the enlightened master. Who stands here before me? Who are you? And Emperor said, Bodhidharma said, I don't know. And Emperor had no idea what he was talking about. Now, it's interesting in this encounter, you can almost see like they're talking by each other in a way, it seems like, right? Like they're not necessarily seem to be talking about the same thing. And we know that language is very powerful in shaping how we think, how we feel, how we act, right? And there's two verbs, very basic verbs in the English language, to have and to be. And they're very powerful in organizing how we live our lives, these verbs. Many of us live a life of having. We think that the meaning of life is acquiring things, achieving things, appropriating things, accumulating things. And it could be material objects, the right house, the right car, going on the right vacation, belonging to the right kind of groups, et cetera, et cetera. Or it could be having the right kind of friends. Or it could be having the right kind of ideas and opinions. And people build up their sense of self around this idea is I am what I have. I am all these things that I've achieved. Right? And then there's this other way of being in the world, which is just simply to be. Living a life of having is a much more kind of horizontal and surface, where living a life of being is much deeper. Because when we're living a life of being, we don't necessarily have a fixed agenda. We don't have fixed ideas and beliefs. We see all of that as tools that we can use, right? And as Buddhists, as tools we can use to alleviate suffering. That is always the ultimate goal of our practice. So in this case, what we see is that the emperor was very caught up in this idea of having. That is what he thought Buddhism was all about, achieving spiritual, achievements. And Bodhidharma pretty much like floored him by basically saying, especially as, one of the most basic koans there is in Zen is, who are you? Because when you really practice that, and you look and you look and you look, guess what? You don't find anybody. There's no permanent, unchanging self. What we call a self is a combination of conditions that are spun up in a unique manifestation of the oneness and connectedness of all of life. So he could have said, I'm Bodhidharma, but that would have just been his name. That's not who he is, it's just his name. So to be truly in a state of being, kind of the only answer is, I don't know. Because from one moment to the next, this is all changing. And there's nobody here that persists in an unchanging way. Now, some people get a little confused. They think not knowing is like not having information, right? That's a common error of people. The great master Nansen said, the way is neither knowing nor not knowing. Knowing is illusion, not knowing is indifference. So it's not about having information or not having information. It's about not being attached to any of your thoughts and your information. The Korean master Sung Song Sunim used to say, only don't know. Keep a mind of not knowing, a mind before thinking. So now we have another story. This is a dialogue between Master Jizo and Hogan, one of his students. So Master Jizo asked Hogan, where have you come from? Hogan replied, I pilgrimage aimlessly. Jizo asked him, what is the matter of your pilgrimage? Why are you pilgriming? Jesus said, I don't know. And then Master Jizo replied, not knowing is most intimate. And with that, Hogan experienced great enlightenment. When we let go of our fixed ideas, of our deeply held beliefs and concepts, and are just open to what is unfolding right here, right now, the world opens up. And we see the world in a very different way. We see possibilities. We see things that we never noticed before. There's actually a kind of somewhat of an embrace of joyousness with the incredible novelty that each moment provides if we're open to it. That doesn't mean, that thinking is irrelevant or it's not important or we should never think about things. It just means hold your stuff lightly. That's all. Don't get so wrapped up in it. And things go a lot easier, it seems. When Bernie came to New York, he set up a traditional Zendo, and people came and sat and they did sessions and all the typical things you see in Zen Center. But what he also did is he started a bakery. He started a bakery to feed the poor in the Yonkers community, and drug addicts and ex-felons and people have been in jail, and welfare moms and basically the poor and disadvantaged people of Yonkers. And he had no refusal hiring policy. All you had to do was show up on a certain day at a certain time. And if you were in line and they needed 5 people, they just chose the first 5 people. And a lot of the people who had traveled from California, where he originally trained with Maizumi Roshi, left him because he was having them spend a lot of time in the bakery, working with all of these folks. And people were saying, that's not Zen practice. That's not what I signed up for. But what they didn't necessarily quite yet get in their practice is, what does it truly mean to practice? Now, the 6th patriarch, Wei Ning, who's kind of considered the kind of the seminal teacher that launched Zen in China. And all of the current lineages go back to him. He once said that practice, Zen practice, is a state of mind in which there is no separation between the object and the subject. There is no space between you and thou, you and me, up and down, right and wrong, etc. And so whether you're driving your car or cooking breakfast or taking out the garbage or working with a convicted felon, if you're bearing witness, if you're engaged with that person in each moment with the stance of not knowing, that's practice. That's Zen practice. Just like sitting Zazen is Zen practice, which is also a form of not knowing, bearing witness. Yeah. I can remember when my father was dying of cancer. He was at the VA hospital in Providence. He was a war veteran, had been a POW for 4 years in World War II. And I would go and go to his room. And we would just sit in his room for hours and not say anything. Just sitting there together. Because when you have a terminal diagnosis, the whole idea of having a life no longer matters. Because your life is going to end. And I remember when the doctors finally came and said, he's got a tumor in his liver the size of a football. There's nothing we can do. You should take him home. And my older sister was a hospice nurse. And so we were driving to her house from the VA, and my dad was sitting in the back seat. And I was driving. I looked in the rearview mirror, and he was staring out the window. It was on May 13th, the first week in May. He was staring out the window, and he was like transfixed. There was like this expression on his face, like he was seeing something amazing. I said, Dad, what is it? And he said, the grass is so green. I think he entered a state of not knowing there, of just being. Perhaps for the first time in a long, long life that entailed a lot of suffering. There's a story about this has to do with bearing witness, a story about a lay adept named Layman Pang. He's a pretty famous Chinese guy. And both his wife and his daughter, Ling Chao, were highly realized adepts. And one day, they were selling baskets, and Layman Pang lost his footing and he tumbled down a bank near a bridge and landed flat on his back. And his daughter ran down and immediately threw herself on the ground next to him. And Layman Pang said, what are you doing? And she replied, she said, I'm helping you. I'm helping you. A really sweet example of bearing witness. Because when we bear witness, we become the situation to a certain extent. I'm a licensed mental health clinician, and I work for the VA, and my job is to do clinical workups and enroll veterans in mental health services to mitigate the criminal charges that they're facing in the court. And so, most of the time they are guilty, unfortunately, of the offense that they've committed. So the name of the game is to wrap as many mental health services as we can around them, so that as they're going through the pretrial process, which is often months, sometimes it can even take a year or two, they can demonstrate to the court that this particular event that's happened in their lives has become a defining moment, and they are now taking care of their mental health issues. And a majority of these veterans who end up in court did not have prior criminal records when they went in the military. A lot of their offenses are related to things that they experienced while in the military, particularly our combat veterans who usually come back, with extensive post-traumatic stress disorder, like an alcohol addiction and anger management issues and domestic violence, and just a whole host of difficult things to try and live with. And I know, I've worked with, addicts, I've worked with sex offenders, I've worked with people who are domestic violent with their spouses and their kids. One of my veterans is one of the more well-known white supremacists in the state. And in order for me to be of service to them, I have to come to my work each day with a mind of not knowing and bearing witness to what is needed right now. What do we need to do right now to move this along in a way that alleviates your suffering and the suffering of others? And that's the work. And the three tenets are a very powerful, useful tool for keeping me focused and on point with what I'm doing every day with the folks I work with. Because it can get really overwhelming. Some of the stories and some of the history and some of the actions that unfold while people are going through some of the worst times of their lives can be disorienting for a caregiver, and question, your effectiveness and am I actually making a difference? But by letting go of my fixed ideas about all that and just coming back to what do we need right now? What can we work on together? And the bottom line is the reason it works is because we get in relationship with each other, right? We get in relationship with each other. It's hard to get into a relationship with someone that you're judging pretty harshly. It's hard to get in a relationship with someone that you find it boring, or disgusting. But if you really want to, metaphorically go into hell and liberate all beings who are living a hellish existence, you got to check that at the door. You really do. And especially with veterans, because they, for right or wrong or indifferent, they don't suffer fools gladly. They're tough. If they detect a hint of hypocrisy or being inauthentic, they won't have anything to do with it. That's it. They're done. All right. Another story I wanted to share is this whole idea of bearing witness and not getting too spun up in all of your ideas and beliefs about things. There's this famous story about a university professor who was kind of a self-expert on Buddhism and Zen, and he spent many, many years studying everything he could about it, reading every book, writing books about it, giving lectures. And his dream was to meet an authentic Zen master so that he could, speak to him and talk to him about all these things that he'd been studying all these years. And he finally was able to get an audience with an actual Zen master. And he went in to meet the master, and the master was sitting there at this little table and a couple of cups of tea, a little tea. And the professor was so beside himself, having this opportunity, that he just went on and started talking about all the stuff that he knew and all these books that he had written, and all of his opinions about Zen. And the teacher said, well, would you like a cup of tea? Would you like a little tea? And the professor said, yeah. And so, he continued to talk again. And the Zen master started pouring tea in his cup, and he kept pouring and pouring, and pretty soon the tea spilled over the top of the cup onto the table. And the professor was like, why did you do that? Nothing more will go in. And the master said, you came here to learn about Zen, but you're so full of your own ideas, nothing more can go in. If you really want to understand Zen, you have to first empty your cup. So, Suzuki Roshi, who founded the San Francisco Zen Center, is kind of renowned for this book that he wrote called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And this is the mind of not knowing. This is what he wrote about. And the famous quote from that book is, in the mind of a beginner, there are many possibilities, but in the mind of an expert, just a few. Again, the difference between kind of having knowledge and being present with what is unfolding in each moment. So that leads us now to the whole notion of taking action. So I like to think of the three tenets like this, is not knowing is kind of the stance. Bearing witness is the actual practice. And action is the result. So not knowing is kind of the general orientation to approaching the situation with no fixed ideas. Okay. Bearing witness, just being present with what's unfolding, trying not to let your thoughts and previous concepts, obfuscate what's happening right in front of you. And out of that arises action. We used to say loving action. I think we still do. Now, when I first heard this, I thought to myself, that sounds nice. Not knowing, bearing witness, and then loving action just appears like magic. But it's actually kind of the way it happens, interestingly enough. I don't know how many times I've been with someone working through a difficult issue, really paying attention to what they're saying and what they say they need, and working in a collaborative relationship with them. And just trying something that we together come up with. And it works. Not because it was my idea or I brought some great learned knowledge to the situation, but because I was willing to be in a relationship with another person, and together we figured it out. And we can do that with anyone. Anyone. So there's a famous Zen story where Yin Yang asks his Dharma brother Dawu, why does the Bodhisattva of compassion have so many hands and eyes? Dawu says, it's just like reaching back for a pillow in the dark. That is compassion. That's what compassion is like. It is simple and natural as reaching back for a pillow in the dark. So if you're not familiar with Kuan Yin, or as she's known in Sanskrit as Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, she is the Bodhisattva of loving compassion. And if you ever see a picture of Kuan Yin, you often see that she has like 1,000 arms and on each hand there's the palm of her hand there's an eye. And that iconography kind of suggests that Kuan Yin is ever present and hears all of the suffering and all the cries of suffering in the world, and then takes action. So in this particular story, Yin Yang was kind of saying, what does the Bodhisattva compassion, why do they have so many hands and eyes? In other words, how does compassion function, right? And Dao says, well, it's just like, at night, when you kind of reach back for your pillow, it's natural. It's not something special. It's not something you have to get all kinds of training to do. Because when you really practice not knowing and bearing witness, you allow that basic goodness that exists in all of us to manifest. And it does. And it does. And I did a training with Fleet Mall. And one of the things that I said to him is that, the best thing that we can do sometimes when we're trying to work with folks and help them or help ourselves is just get out of the way. Practice not knowing, whether that's Zazen or being, very mindful of your actions as you do what you're doing, and get out of the way. Don't think about what needs to happen or what the outcome has to be, etc., and just let it unfold. And you'll be surprised how that works. It initially develops a certain amount of faith that will happen, but then you just see that it does. It just, it is the natural outflowing of our basic goodness. Okay, so I've done a lot of talking here. And so I thought maybe what we could do as a group now is I'm going to provide another example. I'm going to ask you all to kind of reflect on the three tenets and how they may be showing up in this particular story. Okay. So this is a little story from a little book called 101 Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, 101 Zen Stories. So here it goes. Tanzen and Akita were once traveling together down a muddy road. Some of you may already know this. A heavy rain was still falling. Coming around a bend, they met a lovely girl in a silk kimono and sash, unable to cross the intersection. Come on, girl, said Tanzan at once. Lifting her in his arms, he carried her over the mud. Akito did not speak again until that night when they reached a lodging temple. Then he could no longer restrain himself. We monks don't go near females, he told Tanzan, especially not young and lovely ones. It's dangerous. Why did you do that? I left that girl there, said Tanzan. Are you still carrying her? So how might we see the three tenets working in this interchange between these two monks? Any thoughts on that?
And if I can help here, Daikan, anybody would like to comment on this story? I can see everybody, so go ahead and wave your hand and unmute yourself. And you're among friends, so feel free.
Yeah. Don't let your ideas get in the way. Yeah, Andrew.
What strikes me is the spontaneity of it, and how he just let his natural compassion, which was to help across the mud. So that's the action arising out of the simplicity of not knowing and bearing witness.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Amelia.
Who was it you said compassion is as simple as reaching for a pillow in the dark?
Yeah, that was Dawu.
Thank you. I wanted to write that down. And also I was thinking of that, the act of just helping the girl across is like just reaching for the pillow. Like you just naturally do it. Imagine how many thoughts you'd carry with you, leaving a poor girl stranded next to the mud and walking off because it's against the rules.
Yeah, and what about the other monk? What was going on with him? Yeah, Susan.
I wanted to ask actually, because I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but at the end of the story, did you say Tanzen said, "I left her. Are you still holding her?" Was it something like that?
Yeah.
So he was saying he didn't actually take her over the river, or was that what he was saying, or that he'd left her on the other side?
No, I think what he's saying is Aikido was the younger monk. There's a little context here. Okay, so in this story, this is in ancient China, and what happens there is on certain periods of the year, they do these intensive practice periods. So there's usually one in the summer for 3 months, and then there's one in the winter for 3 months. And during those practice periods, the monks would often travel to another monastery where they're not currently training with the teacher, just to see what the other teachers are like, and to spend time getting to know the other teachers and the practice there. And so in those days, they would pair a senior monk with a kind of a novice monk, right? And then they would go out together. And so in this particular story, Tanzan is the senior monk who's been practicing for years. And Aikido's, the new person, right? And he's learning about all this. So kind of where this story kind of turns is Aikido, he disapproves that Tanzan picked her up. He thinks he violated precepts by doing that. He says, "Why did you pick her up? We're not even supposed to look at women, And think about it, this probably happened in the morning, so and they would take a vow of silence from sunup to sundown. So all day long, and this is spinning in Aikido's head, like, why did he do this? That was a violation of the precepts. He's supposed to be teaching me and training me and being an example for me. And so when he kind of blurts out, he says, "We monks don't go near females." This is what he says to the older monk. And the old, especially lovely ones, "It's dangerous. Why did you do that?" And the elder monk says, "I left the girl there. Why are you still carrying her?" Right? So Aikido's mind has been in hell, right, all day long, right? Because he was fixated on the idea that the vows that he took are ironclad rules, right? Which just goes right back to the first tenet, When we are not able to hold these things lightly, it can really cause us to behave in ways that are not skillful and potentially even harmful. Imagine what would have happened if this younger monk was there by himself and saw this young woman. Probably wouldn't have done anything. He probably just would have left her there. Is that helpful, Susan?
Yeah, I guess that was the clincher for me when he asked, "Are you still holding her?" It was just beautifully brought that across so beautifully in my mind. Yeah. Embodied.
It's a powerful teaching, about how we can hold things in our mind in such a way that we actually cause harm to people and to ourselves.
Thank you.
Very good. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, so you mentioned the word fixation or fixed ideas, and that is obviously what Aikido is holding on to. And I see that sometimes a lot in my practice because I've been practicing so long. And, of course, we do all the rituals and all the expectations and the responsibilities at our temple at the Zen Center of Denver. And, since I have that, I sometimes forget that, I'm getting too in the box.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in our culture, not our culture, this is probably true of mankind worldwide. There's such an emphasis on understanding and knowing and being clear and figuring things out and having the correct opinion, the correct view, the correct values, et cetera, that we forget that much of that we create. We create this stuff. And one of the things that I've always found particularly attractive about Zen is it's not dogmatic, it's pragmatic. The kind of truth criterion is what works. An idea is valuable if it works, right? And even the Buddha, when he was, when he was basically dying and he laid down and, he didn't have much time left, they asked him, what's your final sermon? What's your departing teaching? And he essentially said, don't believe anything I said unless you find that it actually works for you in your life. Yeah. And that dovetails in our country, in our culture, with the only real philosophy that was ever developed in the United States, which is pragmatism. It was developed by John Dewey and blocking out his name at Harvard University, William James, and others. And their view, philosophical view, is life has meaning when we do things that work. And the rest is kind of speculation. One of the things that Buddha was criticized about in his lifetime is he was asked a lot of big metaphysical questions. What happens after you die? Why are we here? What is the nature of reality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He basically didn't answer those things. He would kind of keep noble silence and not answering those questions. And they finally kind of pressed him one day and said, what's up with that? Why don't you, tell us what you think about all this stuff? And he said, I'm not here to teach understanding. I'm here to alleviate suffering. And he used the metaphor, if someone was shot by an arrow, they might say, well, before you can pull the arrow out or before you can attend to my potentially fatal wound here, I want to know who made this arrow. I want to know where the feathers came for this arrow. I want to know where this wood came from. And how long did it take to make this arrow? In other words, I want to understand all these things. And in the meantime, they die. Because all that needs to happen is we need to take the arrow out. That's what's important here. So again, I don't want to beat this horse too badly. There's nothing wrong with ideas. There's nothing wrong with concepts. We couldn't really function without them. You won't find any raccoons running around on the moon. We're the only species that have been able to get ourselves up there because we have this incredible ability to conceptualize and problem solve. And it's a fantastically powerful gift that we have as a species. But there is a dark side to it. There is a downside, and we can get so wrapped up and spun up and what we believe that we stop seeing what's actually happening right in front of us. Okay. We've got time for, I think, a couple more questions, Jeff.
Yeah, we do. We have 8 or 9 minutes, something like that. Anybody have something to bring?
Yes, Bill.
Yeah, I liked, I thought it was unique when you described dukkha as not, a lot of times I've heard it described as the wheel being kind of out of balance, but you're actually saying that it gets stuck. And I thought that was an interesting metaphor there. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yes, Andrew.
I'm not sure I have a question, but I have kind of a reflection. So I guess I have an interest in service, and I think for a long time I was kind of resistant to that. And one of the questions I used to ask people, and this is a question I don't ask anymore because I've kind of settled it, but one of the questions I would ask is, how do we trust our own good intentions? And I've gotten different answers from different wise mentors of mine. I'm thinking of one of the responses I got from a friend of mine, and he said to me, he said, when your action is motivated by the person in front of you rather than some ideology. And I'm thinking that really, and I think that's why these three tenets resonate with me. And I'm really, what I'm taking away from this evening is the naturalness of compassion when we're able to not know and bear witness. Yeah, that's basically
Yeah,
it.
and this is where that phrase, not knowing, is most intimate. You're just describing that, rather than all your preconceived ideas about this person, you're just present and listen to them and look at them. Notice, their body language and hear, hear what they're not saying. You know what I mean? We become much more intimate in that space with them. We join with them. We enter a relationship with them. Now, this is not an easy practice, okay? Because the entire world is trying to drag you in the opposite direction. Okay. Our entire culture, the way we think about things, what we sometimes firmly believe is actually, my teacher used to talk about the one body, and the metaphor was, if I cut my left hand, right, I would immediately do something to stop the bleeding, right? Because it's one body, the oneness and interconnectedness of this body, right? But if I'm walking down the street and I see a homeless person with a cut hand who's bleeding, do I walk by? That's disconnecting from the oneness and interconnectedness of life, as opposed to connecting, which is the natural way of life. Is to be connected, to be interconnected. We are interconnected. We depend on each other. We can't, nobody and nothing comes into existence in and of itself. Nothing and no one goes out of existence in and of itself. It's always dependent on other things. And when you really deeply begin to practice and realize this, it's hard not to be of service to someone, to take up some kind of practice that's in service. I remember when Bernie was teaching at Harvard Divinity School, and I used to drive him down, and we'd kind of smoke cigars. He was a character. And after he would get done, we'd go over to Harvard Square and get a cup of coffee. And one day, after his class, we were walking over to Harvard Square, and this guy kind of popped up. He was a homeless guy, very, didn't smell well. He was dirty, et cetera. I was like, hey, man, you got any spare change? And Bernie walked up to him and said, hey, how are you? How you doing? And they got into a conversation that went on for 3 or 4 minutes because Bernie completely accepted him just as a person, right? He didn't see him through all the other things that we often characterize homeless people as, right? And it was like, it was almost like, it blew my mind because it was like, these guys are interacting like they've known each other for 20 years. You know what I mean? Bernie had that ability to bring that out in people because there wasn't a filter there. You know, he was being completely with them. Okay. And when it was over, the guy didn't even ask him for money. He said, man, it's been great talking to you. God bless you. And Bernie said, God bless you. And they went just like two friends having a conversation. You know, that's not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action.